All right, we'll go ahead and get started, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. For the hastening and the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. Knowing that we are coming closer to the day of Thanksgiving, I wanted to allocate tonight's topic to the concept of giving thanks to the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving in the conventional sense of the word. If you go back to where this holiday comes from and the background and the context of it, even a little bit of reading, if you do in this regard, you will soon realize, or very quickly realize, that it doesn't really come from the background that we were normally taught growing up in the society. It comes from a different background, a background that one should not really be very thankful for if you're celebrating it for that purpose. And therefore, when we come to these holidays, it's important, first of all, for us to always look into their backgrounds and see how they became part of the society and part of the culture that we live in. And number two, see how we can, if school is off, if we have a break, how can we take these days and try to celebrate them in the way Islam would want us to celebrate these days. That's number two. And number three, of course, as a general point for our parents, we always want to highlight the Islamic holidays even more than the normal holidays that we have. Because we want our children to grow up with that culture. We want our children to recognize the Islamic holidays that they come across. And when they come across the normal holidays, of course, they know them, they understand them, their schools are off, so it's not like they're going to miss them. But as much as we try to highlight the other holidays, the Islamic holidays more, this is more compatible with the culture that we want to raise them in. It's not to say that, if someone celebrates this holiday or that holiday, it's necessarily something that's haram or not allowed. That's not what we're saying. But it will help if other holidays are highlighted and we make an exerted effort to make them a part of the lives of our children. And slowly, as our children grow up and they mature, then of course they understand what their religion dictates, what their religion asks of them, and they understand the importance of a day in which the Prophet was born. What's the importance of a day like this, as opposed to, for example, another day that society has come together and decided that this is a holiday, for example. The significance of the first is a true, genuine, fundamental significance. The second is just a function of life. And this is really the viewpoint that we want our children to come to slowly. And that happens by parents taking an active approach in terms of highlighting the other holidays, the Islamic holidays that we have. So we don't celebrate these in the conventional sense. Again, not just because of the Islamic aspect of it, but even because of the background from which many of these holidays come from. If you do a little bit of reading and you read into the history of them, many of them are being questioned today in terms of where they came from and whether this day that I'm celebrating is even a day to be celebrated. But nonetheless, it's a day known to give thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is something that, of course, within Islam and pretty much in every faith out there is considered valuable. And so that's why tonight, inshallah, we're going to be talking about this concept, about the idea and the concept of being thankful, being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that which He has blessed us with. And this is a concept that comes up over and over in the verses of the Quran. It comes up over and over in Hadith. And for those who remember, we had multiple talks on this topic earlier. I can't remember if it was last Muharram or the Muharram before that. We had multiple talks on this topic, and so there's a lot to be covered. So tonight, inshallah, I just want to cover some of the other ahadith that we didn't have a chance to touch on in our talks, to touch on these ahadith a little bit more. And understand, first of all, what does it mean to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is it even possible to be thankful and grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And if it is, how do I make that happen in my life in a practical sense? Does being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply mean that when I drink a cup of cold water, for example, or I have a cup of coffee, or for example, I'm hungry and I have a meal, that at the end of it I say, Alhamdulillah, oh Allah, I thank you. Is this the meaning of thankfulness in Islam? Or is this one level of it? There are other levels of it. That's what we want to delve into today. As I mentioned, Quran and Hadith give a lot of importance to this. So when you go to a Hadith, I want to share this first Hadith, and this one is from Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. He says this, very beautiful, and this will be the framework for essentially our whole discussion. He says, "Ash-shukru zinatul ghina." He says, being thankful, being grateful is what adorns, what beautifies wealth, what beautifies you receiving blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want to beautify it, if you want to make it look good, the way you do that is with your shukr. And then he continues, he says, وَالصَّبْرُ زِينَةُ الْبَلْوَى. And when things don't go right and you are tested, the zina, the adornment for the one who is being tested is sabr, is being patient. When you are tested, what makes it beautiful is your patience. When you are blessed, what makes it beautiful is your thankfulness, your gratefulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's delve into this a little bit. What does it mean for me to be thankful? Can I even be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not? Because we read in the verses of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with so many blessings that we cannot count them. Before I go into this, I do have to mention this one point, and this is something we've alluded to in some of our previous talks. A lot of times when we think about the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, we want to count them. Quran says, وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. You won't be able to count them. And so many of us might think to ourselves, well, let me see if I can actually count them. And if you do start counting them, usually you categorize them in bigger categories. And these categories might be 4 or 5. And before you know it, these 4 or 5 categories are done. And so it seems as though you are able to count them. You say, Ya Allah, I thank you for my parents. I thank you for my friends and relatives. I thank you for my wealth. I thank you for my health. What else is there? I thank you for your religion. Maybe you can keep going for another 10, for example, different categories. But then you might think that, well, I just counted these blessings. Or you might say, you know what, Allah, I thank you for the blessings you gave me in this world and the blessings you gave me in the next world. Yes, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings in this fashion and this manner, yes, it's possible. But what you don't understand and what we don't pay attention to is that every one of these categories is then broken down into thousands of other blessings. You say, Ya Allah, I thank you for my health. Say, oh, see, that's one blessing. That's not one blessing. That's 1,000 blessings coming together. That's 1,000,000 blessings coming together that you're healthy. It's 100, 1,000 things coming together that makes you healthy in this moment. So yes, you can bundle it up and consider it to be one blessing, but in reality, this is not one blessing. So when the Quran says you can't count the blessings of Allah, it means that if you break these down and you look at a blessing just by itself, then you won't be able to count it. Otherwise, yes, if I categorize them in big, general categories, then yes, of course I will be able to count them. But if you break it down, the health of the human being, just the fact that I'm healthy, how many things have to go right for me to be healthy? How many things have to be a certain way for me to be healthy? My heart has to be working, my limbs have to be there, my organs have to be working, each of them in their own system. My DNA has to be a particular shape. Proteins in my body have to be in a particular way. The fat in my body has to be in a particular way. They all have to interact with one another in a particular way. There are thousands of functions happening in the body. For you to sit there and say, well, I'm healthy, that's blessing number 1. If you break it down, you realize this is not one blessing. This is thousands of blessings working together. And yes, in your mind, in order to simplify this counting, you categorize them all under one blessing. So this is very important to keep in mind. So having this in mind, now the Quran is saying, listen, you can't thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings. Why? Because you can't even count them. But beyond that, now you find in Hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was having a conversation with Musa alayhi salam. Ya Musa, He said, thank me the way I am to be thanked. And in the Hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains that, listen, just the idea that you understand that you can't thank me, that's enough. I will count that as a thanks from you. So the Prophet is narrated that Musa alayhi salam was speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, فيما أوحى الله عز وجل إلى موسى عليه السلام يا موسى أشكرني حق الشكر. Musa, thank me the way I'm supposed to be thanked. Thank me for all my blessings. Thank me properly. And of course, Musa asked the question that many of us would have. فَقَالَ يَا رَبِّي وَكَيْفَ أَشْكُرُكَ حَقَّ شُكْرِكَ. How would I be able to thank you the proper way? وَلَيْسَ مِن شُكْرٍ أَشْكُرُكَ بِهِ إِلَّا وَأَنْتَ أَنْعَمْتَ بِهِ عَلَيْهِ. How can I thank you when every time I want to thank you, this thanks that I provide, or this thanks that I speak of, is itself a blessing that you bless me with? How am I supposed to do this? And then he understood what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was trying to say to him. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said this, قَالَ يَا مُوسَى الْآنْ شَكَرْتَنِي. Now you have thanked me properly. حِينَ عَلِمْتَ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنِّي. Now that you have realized that even the thanks that you try to say towards me, even the thankfulness that you try to show towards me, that is a blessing from me as well. In other words, now that you have realized that you cannot thank me, I will count this as a proper way of thanking me. I will count this as the full measure of being thankful to me. Understanding that no matter what you do, you won't be able to thank me for the blessings that I have blessed you with. So at the first level, you look at this concept of being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Say, well, I want to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Hadith, they speak of how grateful it is, right? Or how great it is. The verses of the Quran, they speak of how great it is. The Hadith says that the one who eats food and he is thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the food that he has been provided is like the one who is fasting because he was thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. And then it says the one who is healthy but is thankful for his health, he is given the reward of the one whose health has been taken away from him and he is patient. These are big claims. The reward of the one who is not healthy and he's patient is not a small reward. It's a very, very big reward. It's not a small thing. And now the Hadith is saying if you're thankful, this is what's going to happen. So I want to be thankful now. I hear all these beautiful ahadith. I say, okay, I want to be thankful. And in the verses of the Quran says that if you thank me, I will add to your blessings. Okay, even more incentive for me to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then I start to look into it. I realize that, in reality, number one, I can't even really thank Him because it never ends. It never ends. I can't thank Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows this. And because He knows this, when He told us that if you thank me, I will add to your blessings. لَإِن شَكَرْتَنِي or لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. If you thank me, I will add to your blessings. He knows that you can't thank Him properly. Therefore, He is speaking about a different types of thanks. And now this is where our discussion takes on a more practical approach. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about a practical way of thanking Him, this again has different levels to it. The basic level of it is what we know of. We come across a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say Alhamdulillah. Something happens in our life, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The hadith of Imam al-Sadiq says, when he was describing the character of the Prophet, he says the Prophet was such that if something happened that made him sad, if something bad happened, bad in the sense that it wasn't something he wanted for it to take place, then he would say, Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. May Allah, I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for everything. And then if it was something that was happy or brought happiness to him, he would say, Alhamdulillah ala hadihi ni'mah. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this blessing that He has blessed us with. So then this is the first level where you use your tongue and you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another hadith we read that the Prophet, he was on his way with some of his companions. Inna Rasulullah kana fi safarin yasirin ala naqatin. He was on one of his camels and it seems as though he had multiple camels. إِذَا نَزَلَ. Then all of a sudden he got off of his camel. فَسَجَدَ خَمْسَ سَجَدَاتٍ. And he did sajda 5 times. And the people around him, they were surprised. فَلَمَّا أَنْ رَكِبَ قَالُوا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ إِنَّا رَأَيْنَاكَ صَنَعْتَ شَيْئًا لَمْ تَصْنَعْهُ. Ya Rasulullah, you're doing something we have never seen you do before. You were riding, you got off of your camel, you did 5 sajdas. What's going on? The Prophet starts to explain. قَالَ نَعَمْ إِسْتَقْبَلَنِي جِبْرَائِيلُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. He says, Jibra'il came to me. He approached me. فَبَشَّرَنِي بِبِشَارَاتٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. And he gave me 5 pieces of good news. And then he says, فَسَجَدْتُ لِلَّهِ شُكْرًا لِكُلِّ بُشْرَى سَجْدَةً. And for every blessing that he gave to me, I did 1 sajda to shukr in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one level of being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That when they give you the good news, that you recognize and you remind yourself and you remember that this is the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether that means you say Alhamdulillah, whether that means you actually go to sajda. These are all forms of the basic level of being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even these have value, even these are important, otherwise the Prophet wouldn't be doing them. But then you move on from this. Then you find in the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He keeps bringing up the idea of shukr, keeps bringing up the idea of being grateful. And it seems as though a different meaning of being thankful is being intended in these verses of the Quran. If you remember in the tafsir of Surah Al-Insan at the very beginning, we said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in 3 verses, He gives a general framework for how the life of the human being, what the life of the human being is all about. He says, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِي فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. The human being was nothing. He was a drop of fluid, and then we created him into a human being. And then we gave him eyesight, and we gave him his ears that he could listen. And then the 3rd verse says what? إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلِ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. Then we guided him to the right path. إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. Either he takes it or he doesn't. But the word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used was what? Shukr. Either he is grateful or he's not grateful. Either he is grateful for this blessing that we gave him or he's not grateful. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, if you act upon my teachings, you are grateful. If you don't act upon them, you are ungrateful. So shukr here seems to be used in a different meaning than when they give me good news and I do sajda to shukr. That when they give me good news, I say Alhamdulillah. This is one level of it. Then there goes to a deeper level. This is why the verses of the Quran say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Zumar, He is addressing the Prophet. He says, بَلِ اللَّهَ فَاعْبُدْ. Don't worship any of their idols or any of their gods. بَلِ اللَّهَ فَاعْبُدْ وَكُمْ مِنَ الشَّاكِرِينَ. And be amongst the grateful. This doesn't go hand in hand. What does it mean? Worship me and thank me for your blessings? No. This shukr that the Quran is speaking of is a different type of shukr. Not a different type fundamentally. It's a deeper level of the same concept. And this one only shows itself in your actions. Meaning what? Meaning that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants me the blessings that He has granted me, if I want to be thankful to Him, I can't take them and use them to sin. Can't take them and use them to disobey Him. It's not possible. If I'm doing that, I'm being ungrateful for that blessing that He gave me. And so the idea of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the halal and haram that we have in our lives go exactly hand in hand. Because if I am a person who sins, if I am a person who takes the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and uses them for haram, that automatically means I am being ungrateful. So the picture we're trying to, the picture we're trying to provide here is this: that there is no way for me to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless that I'm obeying Him in His halal and haram. This picture and understanding that we have of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where I get a piece of money, I say, Alhamdulillah, I have this money that came to me, and then I move on with my life and I sin and I disobey. That's not being grateful. That's not the gratefulness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. That's a very, very minor and low level of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The true gratefulness means what? Means that when He blesses me with these blessings, I don't use them for haram. The understanding we have is what? They say, did you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings? And I say, oh, let me think about my blessings. And let me thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them. This is part of being thankful. But this is just the surface level. This is just the basic level. The deeper level of it, that without it, I am not truly thankful for His blessings, if I take these blessings and I don't use them for the right purposes, in the sense that I sin with them. If I sin with them, you can say Alhamdulillah a million times, but if you're sinning with His blessings, then you're not grateful for His blessings. This is why in the Quran, worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being grateful for what He has given to you go hand in hand with one another. Because they're not talking about this basic level of saying Alhamdulillah. No, everyone can do that. The worst person on earth, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses him with something, he can take it and say Alhamdulillah. This is not the true level of being grateful. You're grateful when you don't take, for example, these eyes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with, and you look at those things that He has forbid you from looking at. This is a serious problem we have. Lowering the gaze and learning how to do this at a young age. If we have young men listening, this is a habit that you have to learn from right now. Don't let shaitan tell you that, yes, inshallah, after you get married, then everything will be solved. No, it doesn't get solved after marriage. Something you have to work on right now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed you with a beauty. Okay, if a young sister is watching, they have to know that now covering this beauty and keeping it within the boundaries of their marriage, this is something that is a form of being grateful for the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If for the adults of ours, and mothers and fathers, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses me with a wealth, and then I don't use this wealth where it needs to be used, or I don't give away from it the portions that I have to give away from it, whether it's my kafara, whether it's my khums, whatever duties Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set forth for me, then I'm not being grateful. Yes, everybody, brothers and sisters, when they get a piece of money, a piece of wealth, everybody can go to sajda and say, Alhamdulillah. The Prophet didn't just do that. That was the first level. He used to do that. That's important. But then beyond that, he would see how much he is sinning. And the true gratefulness is that I take this and I don't sin. And that's why in the hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says this. He says, أَقَلُّ مَا يَجِبُ لِلْمُنْعِمِ. The least that you can do to the one who has blessed you is that you do not disobey him with the same blessing that he blessed you with. And our organs, our body, our intellect, our thought, these are all blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I can't disobey him with the same blessing that he gave to me. Someone gives you some money, and then you take that money and you invest against them. You take that money and you pay someone to ruin their business. How does this make sense? How is this being grateful to that person? When we commit sins, brothers and sisters, whether that has to do with my akhlaq, whether it has to do with me not treating people fairly, whether it has to do with me yelling in the household, whether it has to do with, God forbid, me being abusive in the house, whether it has to do with me not observing the proper dress code, whether it has to do with me not lowering my gaze or listening to music that is haram. Some music is haram, not all music. then these are all forms of being ungrateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is all forms of me betraying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because now He's blessed me and I say, oh, thank you for this blessing. And the idea is what? We have a wonderful relationship. You've blessed me and I thank you for these. I appreciate your blessings. And then we go and then we betray Him with those same blessings. So being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of it boils down to the haram that might be happening in my life. And if I can eradicate haram from my life, then that is when I am truly being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without that, my thankfulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a very, very superficial essence, has a very, very superficial meaning to it. It has such a superficial meaning to it that the one who disobeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every single day, and the one who obeys Him every single day, that basic level of thankfulness is the same between them. If it's just a dhikr you say, if it's just a phrase you say, well then everyone can say that. A prophet can say that, a tyrant can say that too. That's not the full level of gratefulness. The full, deeper level of gratefulness is that I don't take this and sin with it. And it all boils down to this, brothers and sisters. And this is why in many of our talks, I bring the topic back to this point. And this is the one point that, inshallah, I want you all to remember. That at the end of the day, it boils down to the basic halal and haram that we have in our life. If I don't get that done, my spiritual growth is not going to go anywhere. That's the reality of the matter. And if I do get it done in the sense that I look at myself, I look at what haram happens in my life, and I remove it from my life, this person is going to grow from a spiritual perspective. As I've said many times, spiritual growth doesn't have to do with your emotions, doesn't have to do with feelings in the sense, emotions and feelings are very important, but it doesn't have to do with them in the sense that that is not what it is gauged by. You don't gauge your spirituality based on how spiritual you feel. You gauge your spirituality based on your actions. Once you take care of the actions, the emotions will come. Once you take care of the actions, the feeling of a connection between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will come. Sooner or later, it will come. You gauge spirituality based on in reality, as they say, on the ground. Are you disobeying Him or are you not? Because if you continue to disobey Him, then His love will slowly make its way into your heart. And this is the true form of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these dates that we have coming forward, and of course we aren't able to meet with family and, because of these restrictions that we have. And of course we have to be careful in this regard. But as these days come, yes, we think to ourselves, we remind ourselves of everything that we have been given and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with so many blessings. That's the first level. Then the second level, I ask myself, what am I doing with these blessings? Now you might say, well, am I using them in the best way or maybe not in the best way? That's one thing. But at the very least, I can't be using them to disobey God. Can't be using them to commit haram. That's the very least that I have to do. And if I do see that I'm doing that in certain aspects of my life, then I have to have a plan. How am I going to eradicate that from my life? How am I going to remove that from my life? Because only then will I truly be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. This is why the hadith of the Prophet says, and with this I will end and I'll move on to the ahkam portion. وَقَالَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ شُكْرُ كُلُّ نِعْمَةٍ الْوَرَعُ عَنْ كُلِّ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ. He says the gratefulness for every blessing is to stay away from every haram of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To stay away from everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has considered a sin. If I sin and then I say Alhamdulillah, this is not the true form of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for the ahkam, I need to explain some points. We were discussing the rulings of a traveler, someone who is traveling as it relates to his prayer. What is the rulings there? The results of a person who travels, or the effects that traveling has on the person who is traveling. We said that there are a number of them. Of course, the 4 rakat prayers turn into 2 rakat. He can't fast. And amongst them is that the nawafil, he cannot carry them out. There was a minor mistake that I made when I was explaining this last week, and I said that all of the nawafil, whereas even though I had it here in my notes, for some reason I explained it in the wrong way. And it's not all of the nawafil that one cannot perform. It is the dhuhr and asr nawafil and isha as well. Those three. Fajr and maghrib, the nawafil, one can continue. And the answer to the question that we had last week, as it relates to Salat al-Layl, or what we refer to as Namaz al-Shab, or the nafilah that we do past midnight, that is also you can do while you are traveling. So that's the answer to the question of that brother or sister. I can't remember who raised that question. The conditions for someone to be considered a traveler. We mentioned some of them. Two more that I have to mention, and then we'll move on to some of the more details, is this. The trip also should not be a trip in which I am going to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether the trip itself is a trip that is considered a sin, or I am making this trip to commit a sin, it doesn't matter. Ayatul Sistan and Ayatul Khamenei, both of them, their ruling is that either way, if the trip itself is a sin, or if you are traveling to commit a sin, then your prayer while you are in this trip is going to be considered full. You're going to continue to pray full. And this has a very deep impact, brothers and sisters, because there are times where we travel to sin. There might be times where I travel, and the point of me traveling is I'm going to go attend a gathering, where this gathering, for example, brothers and sisters are mixing, and there's no dress code and things like that. And this trip that I make, during this trip, I have to pray full. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not consider this trip a real trip because it's being done for the wrong purposes. He says this is not a trip. And I am to pray full while I go on this trip while I come back. Sometimes the trip itself will be a sin. Sometimes I'm traveling to commit a sin when I go there. For example, if it's a trip that's not necessary for me to take, and my mother and father have really asked me to not go on this trip, in the sense that if I go, I will deeply displease them. That's the key terminology here. Number one, and number two, like I said, it's not a necessary trip. Okay? Then if I go on this trip, the trip itself becomes a problem. The trip itself becomes haram for me in that situation. Okay, then these are examples where this happens, for example. Sometimes, no, that's not the case. I'm traveling to go somewhere to, na'udhu billah, commit a sin. Either of these situations apply. My salat throughout this trip is going to be full. It's not going to be broken, or qasr, I should say. That's number one. Number two, the other condition that we have to mention is traveling for the sake of hunting. There is discussion amongst the scholars about whether hunting is haram, halal. Of course, hunting where you don't actually need the food. There's discussion about this. Ayatul Sistani does not consider this to be haram fundamentally, but he does say that if you're going to travel and the only purpose is to go for hunting and this hunting is not needed, then you would pray full again. Now, not a situation we deal with too much, so I'm going to move on from that, but just wanted to mention it. Okay. Two next questions that we have to delve into is, if I know that I'm going to leave the city in a little bit, maybe in an hour, for example, can I delay my prayer so that I leave the city and then pray outside of the city? And I pray qasr now because I'm traveling. Am I allowed to do that or not? The answer to that question is yes, there's no problem in that. One is allowed to delay the prayer until they get, of course it's not recommended, to get outside of the city and then pray qasr. It's definitely not recommended if you leaving the city is going to be after the fadila time, the special time, or the prime time, so to speak, for the prayer. Then obviously it's not recommended. But at the end of the day, this is allowed. It is also allowed for me if I know that I'm going back home and in an hour or 2 hours I'm going to get back home, it is also allowed for me to pray outside of the city before I get back home, because I know that I'm going to be praying qasr before I go back home. This is also allowed, and it's in fact recommended if the prime time of the salat is going to expire by the time I get where? I get home. So these are two more questions that we have to answer. Third question, and inshallah with this we will end, is this: when we talk about the city limits, how do I define what the city limits are? We said the city limits are important for two reasons. First of all, when you want to calculate the distance between where you are and your destination, many times you will have to use the city limits. Okay? So this is why this discussion is important. Number one. Number two, if I know I'm going to go on a trip, let's say I'm going to go on a trip from Dallas to, North Carolina, Georgia, whatever the case may be, right? And it's a very long trip, obviously. I cannot start praying qasr until I leave the city limits. I can't pray qasr while I'm still in the city. Similarly, I can't break my fast while I'm still in the city. I have to wait until I leave and then I can break my fast. Or I can do my salat as qasr. So what are the city limits? Are the city limits what we consider here as city limits? That when you're driving, for example, you see a sign that says, thank you for visiting Dallas, for example. Or when you're driving in, says, welcome to Dallas, for example. Are these the city limits? Of course, this is not the Shar'i city limits. City limits, from the perspective of Ayatollah Khamenei and Ayatollah Sistani, they have a small difference between them. For Ayatollah Sistani, it is the point at which the people of the city can no longer see you normally. Now, this is, of course, a little bit difficult to be able to tell, but it will give you a rough understanding of where the city ends. Okay. And then for Ayatollah Khamenei, he says it's at the point at which it's not too between them, but this is essentially what the city limits are. What if I don't know where this point starts from exactly, so that I can know where to start the counting for the trip that I'm going to go on? Let's say I'm not going from Dallas to Georgia, where I'm sure I'm going to hit the limit. Maybe I'm going from Dallas, for example, to a city closer to us, right? That's not that far away. Let's say I'm going to Waco, for example, right? Okay, where do I start counting the distance from? Well, many cases you have to start from the city limit, but this description that we gave of the city limit seems to be a little bit vague. Inshallah, next week we'll discuss this, that if I don't know exactly where the city limit starts from, then I'll have to we'll explain how you're supposed to go about calculating this distance. This section that we're discussing right now, brothers and sisters, is one of the most misunderstood sections that we have out there of ahkam. And many times, brothers and sisters, they will be praying qasr or they're being praying full and they're doing the wrong thing. Because these rulings, they haven't learned these rulings properly. And there's nothing to blame them for. Inshallah, I mention this so that, inshallah, we learn these rulings so that we know what we're supposed to do. What if I travel very often? What if I'm a student going from one city to another city? These are all questions that, inshallah, slowly we will get to in our following sessions. I want to take a moment before we end for all of us to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, especially marhum Bashir Mirali, if I'm pronouncing the name properly. As the sponsors of tonight's program are Sister Sukaina and Brother Mustafa Muhammad Ali. And the program was sponsored in the loving memory of marhum Bashir Mir Ali. So let's take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of tonight's sponsors, with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim maliki yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين